Brett, I have a question for you. For last time, the CE class, I registered and I paid for. I just checked my license. I didn't see the credit was posted under my account. And
Okay, is it the one from Allegiance title?
uh,
Okay, I'll take care of it.
okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
And I will also need a credit for today's too.
Absolutely. All right,
Hey,
so
Brad, I didn't,
go ahead.
sorry, I didn't get credit for last week either.
Is that Stacy?
Yes.
Okay. Got it. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so with that said, we can go ahead and get started on today's CE class. If you want credit for today, it'll be an hour and it is free. But if you wouldn't mind going ahead and putting in the chat just your name, I don't need your license number. I can get that on my own. And then you need to have your camera on as well. You're more than welcome to hang out and not have your camera on and not get credit. But to get credit, that's kind of what Trek tells me you have to do. So that's the deal. So before we get started on today's subject matter, next week, I strongly encourage you to be here. If you can't, as always, I record these meetings. But next week is the week that I normally do the end of the month recap and sales figures and all that. And we might get to that, but I thought it was more timely to address some tactics that I've come up with to address what the world's going to look like past July once the NAR settlement becomes final. And so, it's been a long month, man. I mean, it was 30 days ago this announcement came out, and I know that if you're like me, you've been bombarded with conflicting information, and I just, when it comes to this stuff, I just get sick and tired of getting sick and tired. And so I figured it was time to stop all that and stop our fear and get in front of this. And so that's what I'm going to be discussing next week. Okay. So without further ado, there is no slide deck for today. Yeah, I'm just going to go through some contracts. And for those of you that just joined, if you want CE credit, please go ahead and put your name only in the chat so I can mark that down. And you do need to have your camera on. So today we are going to review the 1 to 4 family, the HOA addendum, and the third-party financing addendum. So these are going to be skewed more towards buyer representation. So just kind of keep that in mind. But here's the deal. Whether this is your first day on the job or you've been doing this for a while, you can all agree that there are lots of deliverables and lots of due dates that are within all of our contracts. And every client relies on us to keep track of those dates and make sure that everything is going smoothly. The good news about all of our contracts is that for the most part, they do a pretty good job at telling us exactly when things are due. And they also do a good job at saying, if you don't do these things by this date, this will happen. Okay. So, but because there are a lot in here, I think it's helpful to go through what they all are. Right. So I'm going to start with the big guy, which is the 1 to 4 family residential contract. Okay. And so we're going to go in order. And the first, so let me just say that not everything in here that I'm going to review has a black and white, this is when things are due, but everything that I'm going to review revolves around something that is due. All right. Some of it says it's due by a certain date, some of it doesn't. The first thing we come to is this new section they put in here a year or so ago regarding leases. And there are three kinds of leases that might enter into a transaction. A residential lease, which is you got a renter in there, a fixture lease, which is things like solar panels, water softener, security system, and then a natural resource lease, which is very common in Texas, which is natural gas or minerals underneath the dirt. And the lease, at kind of 30,000 feet in paragraph 4, the dialogue reads, except as disclosed in this contract, seller is not aware of any leases affecting the property. After the effective date, so there's your timestamp, and we're going to get to that date, probably the most important in the contract. Seller may not, without buyer's written consent, create a new lease, amend an existing lease, or convey an interest in the property. So that is a big deal. This happens, especially when there's a renter currently in the property. All right, so if there is a renter currently on the property, before the seller even raises their hand and says, I want to sell this property, they already have to have ironed out what's going to happen to that lease. And it's one of two things. The new buyer is either going to inherit that lease in its current terms, or the seller is going to ensure that that renter is no longer occupying the property at the closing date. Okay. Just as a side note, that example creates risk for the new buyer if there is a renter already on the property and the solution on behalf of the seller is to make sure that they're gone, because sometimes they don't leave. So if you have a buyer that is purchasing a home that fits that description, I'm just telling you, it can get tricky. But if you move down to the natural resource lease section, it goes on to say that either, number one, the seller has delivered to buyer a copy of the natural resource lease and the buyer can look at it and decide what they want to do, or seller has not delivered a copy of that to the seller, and seller shall provide to buyer a copy of all natural resource leases within 3 days after the effective date. So there are a lot of areas in this contract that refer to 3 days after the effective date. If you are not in the habit of doing this, you're going to make a mistake if you don't mark your calendar with every contract due date for each client. So if the contract is executed today, which is a Thursday, things like the earnest money option fee, which we'll get into in a second, and things like this are due by the third date after the effective date. All right, so mark that date down. And it says buyer may terminate the contract within X days after the date the buyer receives all natural resource leases, and the earnest money shall be returned to the buyer. So what does that mean? That means that the seller's got 3 days to get it to them. And then in this blank here, we're going to give the buyer a certain amount of days to look it over and determine whether or not to continue on with the contract. And as I mentioned earlier, it says if they do that, they will get their earnest money back. Okay. All right. So because it doesn't specify that this is not calendar days, I would assume that it is calendar days. Okay. As opposed to the earnest money and option fee that spells that out. I'll go into that in a second. But anything that is vague like this, it's due 3 days after the effective date, that's calendar days. Sunday, holidays, whatever. Okay. And so again, if a contract's executed today doesn't count. So it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday in this case. Okay. Sunday, close of business or end of the day. All right. So the biggie that we probably know most about is when is the earnest money and option fee due? All right. And it says delivery of earnest money and option fee. And again, they're combined in this day and age. There was a time where you could write separate checks, but you just combine the two amounts, make the check payable to the title company, or a lot of times they'll offer to get it wired to them, whatever, but it's the total amount. Within 3 days after the effective date, buyer must deliver to XYZ title company, escrow agent at whatever. Earnest money of option fee is down here, right? So buyer shall deliver additional. So in this second paragraph, this is time centric, but this doesn't happen very often. There's just an option in our contracts where if the buyer wants to deposit earnest money that is less than maybe what the seller wants on the initial signing of the contract, and maybe contingent upon some other set of circumstances, they can come back and deposit more. That is what this paragraph is for. Okay, and it says deliver to escrow agent within X amount of days after the effective date. All right, so we all know 5A, that's due within 3 days. And it goes on to say in paragraph 5A2, specifically when that is due and how it's due. So if the last day to deliver the earnest money option fee or the additional earnest money falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the time to deliver the earnest money option fee or additional earnest money as applicable is extended until the end of the next day that is not Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So in our example, today's Thursday. Thursday doesn't count. They got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? But Sunday is a weekend. So your earnest money option fee is due by 5 o'clock on Monday. Okay. So then it goes down and breaks out termination and what happens if you fail to deliver each of those. So let's just take a look at the termination option. A lot of states don't have this, so be grateful that a buyer can just wake up one morning within X amount of days and decide they don't want to go through the sale and get their earnest money back. So paragraph B, for nominal consideration, the receipt of which seller acknowledges and buyer's agreement to pay the option fee within the time required, that's 3 days. Seller grants buyer the unrestricted right to terminate this contract by giving notice of termination, there's a form for that, to the seller within X amount of days after the effective date of this contract, which is considered the option period. Notices under this paragraph must be given by 5 p.m. local time where the property is by the date specified, so on the third date. So I kind of glossed over the word notices. That's why it's important that, because remember, we are not a party to the contract. So all notices in one of those latter pages where agents like to put their own information, that's why it's important to put the contact information for both the buyer and the seller, because that is where those notices are supposed to go. Okay. If buyer gives notice of termination within the time prescribed, the option fee will not be refunded, and the escrow agent shall release any option fee remaining with escrow agent to the seller, and any earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So if the buyer follows the rules, the option fee is forfeited because that's what it says in the contract, but they get the earnest money back. All right, so what 2 forms do you use to do that? Well, one is called buyer's termination of contract. That's what it's 1 pager and it's a notice. And so you'll notice on there that the seller does not have to sign it. You just have to prove that it was delivered within the option period. All right, so a lot of agents ask me, does the seller have to sign it? No, you just have to make sure that it was delivered in time. All right, and then the second document is a release of earnest money. Why is that? Because the earnest money was given to a third party entity, that being the title company. And a contract is not legally terminated in Texas until a decision's made as to who gets that money, the earnest money. All right, so I have seen where a buyer goes under contract. Let's say that happens today, and they have until Monday by 5 p.m. to get their money in per the contract. And they are Johnny on the spot, executed 9 a.m. this morning, and they get an inspector out there by noon today. Inspection report comes back at 4 o'clock. And there is so much wrong with this property that the buyer just knows that they're not going to go forward. Right? It doesn't even matter. There's no amount of asking for repairs. It's not going to, it's too much to take in. So the buyer wants out. But they have not delivered their earnest money and option fee yet. Okay, I have seen many times where the buyer wants to not deposit that money and terminate the contract. Okay, you can't do that. Unfortunately, that's because the contract states that that money has to be delivered. You have to go through the process of depositing that money, the earnest money with the title company, only to, yes, turn right back around and get it back to you. But the very privilege that your buyer's paying for with that option fee has to be paid for. And so the money has to be deposited. So Linda, if you have a question, you'll need to unmute. You can go ahead and ask that.
Has it ever been a time when a buyer asked to extend the option time beyond if they said they needed an extension? And if so, does a form exist for that?
Yes, absolutely. So that's not uncommon, by the way. And that is more common in a situation where maybe the inspection revealed potential mold, potential foundation work, potential electrical plumbing, where you're going to need more time to bring somebody else in to give you an expert opinion. And so you're just going to do a normal amendment to extend the option period. Seller doesn't have to agree to it, but that is the form that you use. And as a side note, it does say in the amendment, buyer agrees to pay seller X amount of money to extend the option period. But the funny thing is, it never tells you when. So you can deliver it that day, you can deliver it 10 days from now. It's kind of one of those weird loops that they haven't really closed in the contracts yet, but that does exist, and that's how you achieve that.
Is there a place that we can add a date in that contract?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so we talked about when it's due, how it's due, what happens if the third day is a holiday or a weekend. Now, be mindful, because over the past several years, there have been new, quote unquote, legally observed holidays. And I mean, it's a safe bet if the third day is, you know, Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's Day, but some other holidays that are new, especially in Texas, my advice is always to get that money in the day that you execute to avoid those kind of misinterpretations. Okay, and it depends on, some title companies are open on Memorial Day. Some title companies are open on MLK Day. So just try and get in front of that. So now we'll talk about the failure to do this. So failure to time, now look, anything in these contracts, if it's capitalized, bolded, or underlined, that's a signal to you that it is a big deal, right? So paragraph C says, failure to timely deliver earnest money. If buyer fails to deliver the earnest money within the time requested, seller may terminate the contract or exercise the seller's remedies under paragraph 15. So whenever you see paragraph 15 mentioned in any of these documents, that's a big deal. That's lawsuit time. All right, or both, it says, by providing notice to buyer before buyer delivers the earnest money. Now, I've mentioned this previously, but here's the deal. If the buyer, and believe me, this is not a green light for your buyer to deliver the earnest money late, but I will tell you that if the earnest money in my example was due by Monday at 5 p.m. and they didn't get it in until Tuesday at noon, is that contract dead, void, or anything detrimental if the seller hasn't come forward? The answer is no. It's still an active contract. It's only when the seller raises their hand and says, you can't do that to me, I'm going to exercise my right to get out of the contract. right? So it's kind of a race to beat the clock. So if, I don't know, the buyer was on a plane back home and it got delayed and they just couldn't deliver the earnest money in time, but they got it in before the seller said, I want to exit the contract, it's still a live contract. Okay, so not a lot of people realize that, but why add that stress to your life? Just have the client get it in as early as possible. All right, paragraph D, failure to timely deliver the option fee. If no dollar amount is stated as the option fee, or if the buyer fails to deliver the option fee within the time required, buyer shall not have the unrestricted right to terminate this contract under paragraph 5. So that's a big deal. It's an and type of deal, or and or. So if up here, hang on. If up here it's left blank, yet you put something down here, I want a 7-day option period, but I'm not going to pay for it. And maybe that was an oversight. You can't imagine how often that actually happens. Then there is no option period. And who's putting in this data? We are, right? So please be careful. This is extremely common. What's even more common is you put the option money where the earnest money goes and the earnest money where the option fee goes. All right, that's a biggie. But if there is no money in there, or if it's not delivered, then there is no option period. And then again, big bold letters, they actually have it itemized out. Time. Time is of the essence for this paragraph, and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. Notice they don't say performance is suggested. It's required that you get that in by the certain time provided. All right, so I've seen a couple of other people join. If you want CE credit, make sure you put your name in the chat and make sure your camera's on so I can give you credit.
Hey, Brad.
Yep.
For that section, and if you was to amend the extend the time for the option period, do you have to put a dollar amount there? I mean,
Yes.
the same. Okay.
Yep.
Otherwise, there's not a.
There's
even
no
if it's just $1 or something
consideration. Even if it's
type of
$1. Yep.
Okay. All right.
Because a reasonable seller will say, yeah, I knew I had foundation issues. I'll give you an extra day
Yeah.
to get somebody in here. You don't need to pay me. Well, just pay me.
Put something there. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. The next paragraph deals with the commitment of title. So it says, I've mentioned this before, title commitment. Within 20 days, they have no more than 20 days after the title company receives a copy of the contracts. That doesn't mean it's on the executed date. It could, the title company could get it a day or two later. So that's why if you represent the buyer, I would insist on a completely executed contract, set of contracts, the day it's executed, right? Because if the seller delays getting those contracts with the title company, you want to do it. And if I were you, I'd do it anyway. It doesn't hurt. All right. So then they can start working on their title commitment. They've got 20 days to do it. That's why if you have a cash transaction, a lot of cash buyers want to close like tomorrow. But the title company has to do what they do, which is make sure that there's no one going to come out of the woodwork after you close that claims rights to that property. And they have 20 days to do that. All right. So it says within 20 days after the title commitment title company receives a copy of the contract, seller shall furnish to buyer a commitment for title insurance. Now it's usually not the seller, it's usually the title company, but they have 20 days to do that. So time constrained, right? And then it says, if the commitment and exception documents are not delivered to the buyer within that time, the time for delivery will automatically be extended up to 15 days or 3 days before closing, whichever is earlier. If the commitment and exception documents are not delivered within the time required, buyer may terminate this contract and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So you know, you've got to be dealing with a pretty lousy title company to not have that happen. But it is important to know this part of the contract, because if your buyer is giving you signals that they don't want the house, they got cold feet, and they're looking for any way to get out, this could be a way that they could get out. Okay. So just be mindful of that. And then it jumps down to talk about the survey. And so unfortunately, you know, a good listing agent will have the survey uploaded into the listing on the MLS, but there is unfortunately no spot in the contract that says already gotten the survey, right? You get that for seller's disclosure, but you don't get that for the survey. So you have to check one of these boxes. So the first one is within X amount of days after the effective date, seller shall furnish to buyer and the title company seller's existing survey of the property and a residential real property affidavit promulgated by the Texas Department of Insurance. Bold, if seller fails to furnish the existing survey or if affidavit within the time prescribed, buyer shall obtain a new survey at seller's expense no later than 3 days prior to the closing date. All right, then it goes on to say, if the existing survey or affidavit is not acceptable to the title company or lender, for that matter, buyer shall obtain a new survey at, and then you get to check who pays for it. So why is that? Well, the first one speaks to, well, the seller said they were going to get this survey within X amount of days and they didn't do it. So they're going to pay for a new one. But the second part of that clause says they did that, but I'm buying the property and the title company and or my lender, who is clearly on my team, says that's not acceptable. So it's the onus is really on the buyer to get a survey. But it gives you an option as to who pays for it. Okay. And then it says no later than 3 days prior to closing date. All right. And then the second option is if there is no survey and the buyer wants to pay for it. And the third one is if there is no survey and the seller is agreeing to pay for it. This is very common, that survey doesn't exist, and then it has to be determined who pays for it. All right, then based on the survey and the title commitment, we move down to what if the buyer doesn't like something within those documents, all right, because that's possible. The survey might have an easement they don't like. It might have proof that somebody's fence is on their property. So it says that the buyer must object the earlier of either the closing date or X amount of days after the buyer receives that commitment. Now, mind you, we just went through an entire set of paragraphs that in some cases say they can get you that up until 3 days before closing. That is a level of stress that I wouldn't want to take on, but it can happen. And so then it says, well, okay, well, I'm supposed to close today, and I just got these documents Monday. I have X amount of days to look that over, right? Even if these days exceed the closing date, right? So you never want to cut it that close, right? Then it says, provided the seller is not obligated to incur any expense. So if the guy didn't have to write a check, seller shall cure any timely objections of buyer or any third-party lender or lender within 15 days after the seller receives the objection. So now it's day 25, day 26. This can be kicked even further down the road if there's something that the buyer doesn't like. As a rule of thumb, the more rural the property, the more likely these situations will come up, right? Cookie cutter subdivision, these issues typically don't come up, but you have to be aware of what can happen, all right? And so if the objections are not cured within the cure period, all right, so let's say the guy wants to do it, but he just can't get it done in time, buyer may, by delivering notice to the seller within 5 days after the end of the cure period, terminate the contract and get his earnest money back, waive the objections. So all of a sudden, everything that I said was a big deal is no longer a big deal. And so those are the two options. If the buyer does not terminate within the time required, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the objections. All right, so if he doesn't say anything about it, it's assumed that he's moving forward. All right, so do you think it's incumbent upon you as the agent to make sure that he's not just confrontational averse and just doesn't want to say anything? Because nothing's a big deal in these contracts until it's a big deal. And this is one of these examples where it could be a big deal. Okay. It says buyer may object to any new matter revealed in the revised commitment or survey or new exception documents within the same time stated in this paragraph, to make objections beginning when the revised commitment, survey, or exception documents is delivered. So if a new document is delivered, they have the same amount of time to say, wait a second, I don't like the way this is either. Now, I always have examples, right? So this actually happened at least one time that I can remember. Agent of ours represented the seller. Buyer, rural property, buyer comes forward and realizes that the next door neighbor's well piping and how they get water to their home is actually partially on this property. This clause was exercised. Seller tried their darndest to get with the town, get with the other owner, and they couldn't make it work. So the contract died, listing came off the MLS, and each person went their separate ways. But this stuff can happen. So make sure that you're reading your title commitments and reading those surveys. There are plenty of classes on how to do that if you're unsure on how to do that, but it's important. Okay, moving forward, we get to the seller's disclosure, and either it's uploaded to the MLS, you would check paragraph B1, right? So you've already received it. It doesn't have to be emailed to you. If it's uploaded on the listing, that is deemed as being accepted. But where the time crunch comes in is if it's not there, it says in paragraph B2, buyer has not received notice within a certain amount of days, and I wouldn't do any more than 3. Any more than that's unreasonable. You want to, buyer needs to understand what the seller knows. But within 3 days, as an example, after the effective date, seller shall deliver that notice to the buyer. This is where it gets interesting. If the buyer doesn't receive the notice at all, buyer can terminate the contract at any time prior to the closing. Could be on closing date. And the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Now get this. If the seller delivers the notice, doesn't matter if it's within the 3 days in my example, or if it's not, buyer can still terminate this contract for any reason within 7 days after the buyer receives that notice or prior to the closing date, whichever comes first, and your earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So think about this. Lots of these sellers will insist on, a short option period and all that. So let's say that, they require a 3-day option period. Heck, let's say it's 5. And let's say that they haven't delivered the seller's disclosure. And this is the only instance where this works. All right. If you've already gotten the notice, what I'm about to tell you is not applicable. But if it takes them a day to get the seller's disclosure, that buyer, doesn't matter what their option period was, they have 7 days from the time they received that seller's disclosure to say, I don't like what I see. I saw that you repaired the foundation last year. I'm out. They get their earnest money back, and seller can't do anything about it. Okay, so the deciding factor is, did the buyer receive the seller's disclosure yet or not? Okay, but this is a nice little cushion for pushy sellers that want to, move the process along faster than it should be. Next is the completion of repairs. All right, so inspection's been done, you've submitted a repair amendment, and all things being equal, they got to be done. And it says, unless otherwise agreed in writing, seller shall complete all agreed repairs and treatments prior to the closing date. Right? And all required permits must be obtained, and repairs and treatments must be performed by persons who are licensed to provide such repairs or treatments, or if no license is required, like a roofer or a foundation person, they need to be commercially engaged in that business, right? At buyer's election, any transferable warranties received by seller with respect to those repairs and treatments will be transferred to the buyer at buyer's expense. If the seller fails to do these repairs prior to the closing date, buyer may exercise remedies under paragraph 15. There's that, oh, I'm going to get sued type of deal. Or if everyone up to this point has been pleasant to work with, you could agree to extend the closing date, as it says here, up to 5 days if necessary for the seller to complete the repairs or treatment. So just because they haven't done it by closing date doesn't mean that the deal is dead. But this dovetails into something that I mention all the time, which is don't wait until the day before closing, or God forbid the closing day, to do a walkthrough. All right, if you've asked for repairs, even if you haven't, you should do a buyer's walkthrough with your buyer 4 or 5 days before closing date to make sure that the home is in the same condition that it was in when the contract was signed. Or secondly, if you did ask for repairs, that they were done. Okay. Linda, did you have a question? You can unmute and ask.
Yes. Yes, I would like to know, so does paragraph 55, F, I'm sorry, apply to an as-is contract? So if they had it as is, if the seller was selling their property as is, would paragraph F still come into play?
Only if y'all have agreed upon repairs. So this only applies if both sides. So let's say someone did list a property and said, I am not doing any repairs. Yet that doesn't stop the buyer's agent from saying, I know you said that, but I really like, the gutters fixed. Well, if the seller signs an agreement that says, okay, I'll fix the gutters, then that's when this applies.
Thank you.
Okay, closing date. No date is more sacred in the contract than the closing date. The good news, it says on or before. So I always say, if you are submitting a contract today, I would allow 2 or 3 days extra past a month to account for negotiation. Okay, but it does say the closing date of the sale will be on or before whatever date you put in there, or within 7 days after the objections made under paragraph 6D, which we just reviewed. All right, so after they've been cured or waived, whichever date is later. If either party fails to close the sale by the closing date, the non-defaulting party may exercise remedies contained in paragraph 15. So this is where, as we move through how we provide value for a buyer as a buyer's agent, God bless them. There's so much in this transaction that is completely out of their control. So if the lender is lousy, if the title company's lousy, this can get delayed. And some of those companies don't think it's any big deal. It is a big deal. Especially if the seller has not been nice to work with, or the seller's agent. The likelihood of them signing an extension is going to be unlikely. So please don't suggest that the closing date to your buyer is a suggestion. It is the date, on or before. Okay, so then it talks about, well, when do I get access to this property? All right, so it is contingent upon one of two things. Either it's going to close and fund, so it can close on Friday, but not close on fund till Monday. When does the buyer get the keys? Monday. That's why I always say avoid a Friday closing. All right. So it's either going to happen then or according to a lease back whereby the seller stays in their home for a certain amount of time and the buyer moves in whenever that lease back is over. All right. So goes on to say smart devices. So this has been added with the increase in various things, you know, Ring doorbells and all that, but it is time bound. It says, look, at the time of closing, seller needs to deliver to the buyer all the passwords, all the equipment, all, you know, ways to access that stuff that is dependent upon an internet connection to the buyer, right? And a lot of the stuff in a home now does. Now, as a side note, if it is a leaseback, it says in the leaseback form, which I'm not going to review today, that the new owner, now the landlord, is entitled to all this stuff: garage door openers, keys to the property, codes to a combo lock that might be on the door. You'd be surprised at how many sellers sell their property, continue to occupy it based on a leaseback, and refuse to give that to the buyer. Okay, it says it in multiple places in the contract. Okay, and then it says casualty loss. So what is that? That's if within the 30 days it takes to close, there's a hailstorm, there's a windstorm, there's a hurricane, there is fire. It says that if any part, not just all, but any part of the property is damaged or destroyed by fire or other casualty after the effective date of the contract, seller has to restore the property to its previous condition as soon as reasonably possible, which is kind of vague. But in any event, at least by the closing date. However, if the seller fails to do that, due to factors beyond the seller's control, so you can imagine, insurance companies are involved, all that takes time, buyer may A, terminate the contract, get their earnest money back, B, extend the time to get that done up to 15 days, and the closing date will be extended as appropriate, or just say, you know what, doesn't matter. So let's talk about what that might be. If this happened to my neighbor, closing date, had a windstorm the night before, 3/4 of the fence fell down. I think the closing date was extended by a day or two just to get that fence back up, but that's a minor example. A major one might be hailstorm blew through. We close 7 days from now. We're 3 weeks in, we close 7 days from now, and there's no way I can even get an adjuster out within the next 7 days, let alone get the thing repaired. Okay, that would be an example of, look, and guys, do not let the home close if there is outstanding work of any kind to be done. The most common is the roof. Even if the title company says that they're going to hold money back from proceeds to the seller, you're asking for trouble. The buyer deserves the property delivered in the condition they're supposed to get it. It's not their fault that there was a hailstorm. They don't own the house yet. Okay, but this paragraph just itemizes out when that, you know, what the timelines are. Okay, and then demand. This happens when there is an earnest money dispute. So it says, upon termination of the contract, either party or the escrow agent may send a release of earnest money to each party, and the party shall execute counterparts of the release and deliver the same to the escrow agent. That's when they're all playing nice. If either party fails to do that, either party, usually the person that's entitled to the money, may make a written demand to the escrow agent, and that's just done via email, for the earnest money. If only one party makes written demand for the earnest money, escrow agent shall promptly provide a copy of that demand to the other party. So buyer gets out, seller doesn't want to release the earnest money, buyer's entitled to it. Buyer says, I want my earnest money. Seller's not signing it. So if the escrow agent does not receive written objection to the demand from that other party, so in my example, the seller, within the next 15 days, escrow agent may, they don't usually, but may disperse that earnest money to the party making that demand reduced by the amount of unpaid expenses incurred on behalf of the party receiving the earnest money. An escrow agent may pay the same to the creditors. If the escrow agent complies with the provisions of this paragraph, each party hereby releases escrow agent from any adverse claims related to the disbursement of the earnest money. So not many title companies will do this because they're supposed to be impartial. And by releasing the earnest money, even though it says it in this paragraph, a lot of them don't want to incur that responsibility. Okay. It then goes on to say damages any party who wrongfully fails or refuses to sign a release acceptable to the escrow agent within 7 days of receipt of the request will be liable to the other party for damages, the earnest money, reasonable attorney fees, all costs of a lawsuit. Okay, that comes up. Right, and then the most important part of this document is this, the executed date or the effective date. People refer to it different ways. Okay, but that is when the clock starts ticking. That is the baseline date for which every other date-related deliverable in the contract is keyed off of. Okay. All right. So for the sake of time, because I don't have a whole lot of time left, and I've only done one contract. So let's do the HOA addendum. All right. So this is just a one-pager. So basically, if a home is within an HOA or a homeowners association, then you have this little sub-governing body that tells the occupants of all those homes what they can and cannot do. Some people think it's a big deal, some people don't. But if your buyer happens to want to work on their car in their driveway, or they want to grill out in their garage or in their driveway, or they want to landscape their front yard any way they want to paint their house any color that they want, the HOA, or more commonly, they want to use that house as a rental property. The HOA may have strong feelings about that. And that's why there's a separate document that says within X amount of days after the effective date, seller shall, all right, so seller shall do this, obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information to the buyer. If seller delivers the information, buyer may terminate the contract within 3 days after the buyer gets it. So why would they ever do that? Because it's going to be a lengthy document. The good news is a lot of that stuff is online now, but it's critical that you don't put more than 2 or 3 days here, because you want to give your buyer enough time to get out if they don't like something. Okay. Now, if the seller doesn't have it for some reason, option 2 is within X amount of days, the buyer's going to go get that and pay for it. And option 3 is buyer's already received it and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract. Buyer either does or does not require an updated resale certificate. If buyer requires an updated resale certificate, seller at buyer's expense shall obtain it, deliver it to the buyer within 10 days after receiving payment. All right, so there's a couple of things that need to happen, but it is all time bound. Now, the other thing, this has happened under paragraph B, material changes. If the seller becomes aware of any material changes in that document, the seller shall promptly give that notice to the buyer. Buyer then, upon getting that information, can terminate the contract prior to the closing by giving written, doesn't say when, could be the day before, by giving written notice to the seller if any of the subdivision information provided was not true, or any material adverse change in the subdivision information occurs prior to closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. Let me give you the example that happened to us. Buyer client bought a home in an HOA in a subdivision that he already lived in. So if anybody should know the rules, it would be him. He bought it to rent out. And oh, by the way, there are dozens of other properties in that subdivision that are rental properties. So what could go wrong? Well, it just came to be that within the past year, the HOA passed a rule that if you're buying this to rent out, you got to occupy it for a year. And that wasn't disclosed. It was new. It didn't get to the buyer in time. Buyer closed and had to deal with this new rule. So he wasn't made aware of it. So it's hard to then go back and prove who knew what when. I hadn't heard, it's about a year ago, I hadn't heard if he just, because you have to apply, you had to apply for a permit to do it. And you could get an exception if you went before the HOA. So I'm not sure if he did that, but I'm bringing up this example as one that's incredibly common because your buyer won't always be forthright in the purpose of why they're purchasing that property. All right, so now is it on you to read the 100 pages in the HOA document to make sure that that's not in there? No. The contract, last I checked, was not between you and the seller, it was between the buyer and the seller. So that's the buyer's responsibility, but the buyer's got to read it. Okay, so that's the HOA. And lastly is the third-party financing addendum. So the first time-bound duty is buyer shall. A buyer shall apply promptly for all financing described below and make every reasonable effort to obtain approval for the financing, including but not limited to furnishing all information and documents required by the lender. Now, it's great that this is in here, but we're not showing homes unless they're pre-qualified anyway. So that's kind of what this means. But then it goes on to itemize the kind of loans they can get. But then you come down to the center of the contract, you know, the pivotal part. Paragraph 2. So at 30,000 feet, it just kind of talks about the buyer's general approval for financing. So what is that? It means that they're approved for the loan and the property passes the approval for the lender. All right. So there's a bold line here. Time is of the essence for this paragraph and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. Well, then it breaks down what approval for financing really means and gives the buyer an out for each. So what is paragraph 2A? Buyer approval means that, okay, the buyer submitted documents, proof of employment, bank statements, and initially the lender said, yeah, you look good. But in order for the underwriter to give their rubber stamp of approval, well, got to be more conversation. Like, are there any, you know, outstanding debts that we want to know about? Is there a bankruptcy? Is there, are you telling me that you're single, but you're really married type of deal? So that is financing approval. And that's why I always suggest giving the buyer 21 days to do that. Anything less than that does not give the lender enough time to really thoroughly confirm that they're approved. All right, so it says if the buyer cannot obtain buyer approval, buyer may give written notice to the seller within X amount of days after the effective date of the contract, and this contract will terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. This is such a big deal that it's an option in the buyer's termination of the contract. So if there are two dates that I would always earmark in your calendar, it's the last date to get the earnest money and option fee in, and it's the last date to get financing approval. Okay, so whatever in my example, whatever the 21st day is. All right, so that is, are you approved for the loan or not? So that is buyer specific. So let's go talk about the home. Well, buyer could get approved for the loan, but if the home doesn't meet certain requirements, then the deal's off. And so I didn't highlight this, my bad. But in paragraph 2B, they have to also meet this property approval. If buyer's lender determines that the property does not satisfy the underwriting requirements for the loan, including but not limited to the appraisal, it's the most common one. If you can insure the property or any lender required repairs. So remember that if it's a VA loan, FHA loan, these things become a big deal. If it's built before, 1980, these things can become a big deal. Even if the appraisal is not met, you can get a conditional appraisal, which means it'll appraise for the amount that you want, but these repairs have to be done. Okay? And the seller doesn't have to do them. All right. So if those conditions aren't met, it then goes on to say, buyer, not later than 3 days before the closing date, may terminate the contract by giving seller notice of termination, and the lender has to prove that the property didn't meet approval. Okay, so some buyers will try and get out with this clause, knowing full well they got approval, but for some reason they don't want the house anymore, and they want the lender to write a letter as such. That's mortgage fraud. So it's got to be a truthful statement. So if buyer terminates using this paragraph, the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. If the buyer does not, property approval is deemed to have been obtained. Okay, so the biggest deal breaker in this paragraph is the appraisal. But a lot of realtors will not realize that this is one or the other, and that they have to be approved for both. So just because they were approved for the loan doesn't mean the deal isn't at risk for dying, because the property may not meet appraisal. It may not be able to be insured. I had one home that the roof was damaged. The seller took the insurance money, never repaired the roof. Buyer couldn't get insurance. It appraised, but they couldn't get insurance. So the deal died. Okay. So these things can absolutely come into play. And without getting into specific deliverables for each kind of loan, that is kind of what the time-bound deliverables are for the third-party financing addendum. Okay, so that, just under 2 minutes here, is what I have for today. So any other questions on that we haven't covered yet for each of these contracts?
No questions. No
Yes.
questions, but I got a comment about the approval and stuff like that. Regardless of who your lender is, sometimes you don't have a say in it. But I work with Steven very closely, and you got to have that relationship with whoever you're working with to make sure this stuff is happening as fast as possible and you're meeting all these deadlines, because these are big deals. And if you get pushed up against the closing date, it gets pretty ugly. So
Yeah.
make sure you're working close with whoever the lender is.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, in a new area where, allegedly we're going to have to at least be proactive about proving our value to buyers agents. I mean, these contracts, I mean, they're just fill in the blank, right? I mean, they're supposed to be easily understood by both us as agents and the client. But where our value comes in is, and the risk that is incurred by the brokerage, is that if you don't know when these due dates are, and you miss one, it could become a big deal really fast, right? Especially things like, I didn't know when my option period ended. I didn't know I had to get the earnest money in by a certain amount of time. I didn't know I had to be approved for financing by a certain time. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, you could point the finger back to the client and say, well, it's your contract, you need to be aware of it. Well, then what do they need us for? Right? So you could prove your value 100 times over by just knowing what these deliverables are and being proactive about it. Right. And I know it's hard because it's a lot at once to throw at a buyer, but it's important. You know, the first 7 days, first 14 days are critical in any buyer transaction. Once that's passed, it's really up to the lender to do what they need to do. Title company does what they need to do, and hopefully it's a smooth close at day 30. But there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done between day 1 and day 14. All right.
So Brad, as far as the appraisal on the seller side, is it fair to be able, is it reasonable to be able to get the appraisal report, or at least if the, you know, if our agents normally forthcoming and let you know what the appraisal actually was when it's on the you know, when it's the buyer that actually gets the appraisal?
Some are,
Well, is it,
some aren't. So if you represent the seller, all you
I
really,
represent, say I represent the seller, yes, yes.
okay. So all you need to know as the seller's agent is if it appraised, yes or no.
Yes, but we
Um,
don't get the report, right? I mean,
You
so,
won't get the report because that is, you know, that's property of the buyer, buyer's lender. And nor can the lender give it to you. Even if you represent, so this is important. This came up recently. If you represent the buyer as the agent, the lender cannot give you their appraisal report. That goes directly to the buyer.
okay,
If the buyer wants to share it with you, that's another thing. But a third party, being the lender, can't even give it to a buyer's agent. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, it can create problems. If the appraisal came in at $50,000 more than the sales price, the seller, I've seen, can get upset in that, oh, well, I should have held out for more, or they all of a sudden want to look for ways to get out of the contract to try and get more money. And so the less said on that, the better. All you want to know is if it was appraised or not.
so, and in that case, am I reaching out to the agent, the
Yep.
lender,
The
the
agent,
agent? Okay,
For a listing, can the seller ask the listing agent to provide their appraisal, and can it be placed in the listing?
so you mean if one was already done, maybe from another transaction?
If the owner, the seller had the appraisal, are they able to give it to the listing agent?
Yes. Yes, and I want to say that in the seller's disclosure, it says that if you have any of those kinds of documents, then if a buyer asks for it, you have to give it to them.
Great. Thank you.
I have a
Keep in
quick,
mind,
What's that?
I have a quick
keep in-
question.
we got two of us talking. Keep in mind on those appraisals that even if a seller has an appraisal, your buyer probably cannot use that appraisal anyway. So you're, you know, unless you don't think the value's there, I'm not sure that it helps you any. An appraisal is not always transferable to another lender. So
Correct.
I think
Correct. And
you're,
it's very specific to that particular transaction. It
to that
won't,
buyer.
right. It like, say that whole deal fell through, we cannot use that same exact appraisal for another transaction. You may have a different lender, and every lender is going to have its own appraisal.
I'm referring to an appraisal that came from the Dallas Central Appraisal District.
Well, so those are done purely to assess tax valuation, and are probably going to always be lower. And it's public knowledge. So a buyer could go on to any of those sites and get that themselves, but it's not really connected to what a home would sell for on the open market.
Yeah.
So I have a quick question, Brad. It happened to me like personally, and I had a buyer before, and we did appraisal. Is the listing agent had the right to ask us how much the appraisal came back to us?
No, they can ask, but
I don't have to tell, right?
correct, you do not have to tell them.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I guess then that's back to my question. Do we just wait for them to give us a thumbs up that,
yes,
you know, is that pretty much?
that's all you're waiting on. Yep,
Okay. All right.
yep. Yep, and anything beyond that, you're risking upsetting the apple cart. You know, I've said this many times where, you know, you'll hear me say, regardless of what side you represent, once that contract is executed, your only job is to close that deal, to make sure that it gets to the finish line with as little dysfunction and disruption as possible. So, you know, asking what the price is doesn't do anybody any good because the seller is bound to that contract anyway.
I think for my purpose, I was just thinking, making sure that it was moving right, you know, still moving along. And
Yeah,
relying on that agent to say, hey, thumbs up or thumbs down. That, I mean, I'm sure if it didn't appraise, then they'll reach out or something.
well, yeah, correct. And so in my
Okay.
mind, if the time to get financing was 21 days, on day 20, I'd be calling because it's going to take 21 days to get underwriting done, get the appraisal done, and then the remaining 7 days is shuffling paper back and forth, getting it to the title company, and making sure that everyone has their disclosures in time. By day 21, all that's been settled. So
Okay.
it'd be a great time to call.
Okay. Gotcha.
You also have a pre-approval on your buyer. If you're the seller and you have a pre-approval on the buyer, you have the contact information for the lender. So you can contact the lender directly and ask him if the appraisal's been done
Yeah,
or when it's expected to be back. So you can go direct with that information.
yeah. Well, and Valerie raises a good point because you'd be surprised at how long they drag their feet on doing that. So I mean, a lender probably not going to do one until after the option period's done anyway. So that's 2 weeks to get an appraisal done. And so some people wait too long. And on day 18, 19, maybe it's not done. Well, that's going to be a problem. So to Valerie's point, calling them well in advance is a good thing to do.
Someone brought up a very good point about the appraisals not sticking with the property and that you might have to get a new appraisal. Now, this only applies with FHA as far as I'm aware, but in that third party, if it doesn't meet FHA appraisal, there's a clause that says the buyer still has the privilege to go forward with the deal.
Yeah,
The word buyer privilege doesn't exist anywhere else in these contracts. So that's a strong thing, and those appraisals will stick with those federally appraised loans. So somebody will have to come in with cash or conventional unless they wait it out.
right.
It's a very strong thing to use if you have an FHA buyer and you want to exercise that privilege to say, look, you're stuck with this whether you like it or not. There's not going to be a new one unless you find a different type of financing.
Yeah,
Right. And the same thing goes with if you have a mortgage insurance, you have to get it, it's over 80%. If Fannie, the mortgage insurance company takes a look at the appraisal and says, there's no way we're going to insure this, that deal's dead too. You come down with more money or forget the property. So
and
MI can deny it.
Lily, how long does the appraisal last with an FHA loan? Is it 6 months?
We don't do FHA. We do, Fannie Mae deals. So for us, it's good for 4 months.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we can make exceptions as needed. If it's got to have mortgage insurance, we will not. Because that's out of our hands, basically.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I mean, it doesn't become a big deal unless the next buyer has the same kind of loan. I mean, if it was
Right.
appraised lower with an FHA, that sticks. But if the next buyer is a conventional loan, then it doesn't apply. So, but I mean,
Yeah.
you're taking your chances.
Yeah. You're right.
All right. Well, if you haven't put your name in the chat to receive credit for today, go ahead and do that. If I drop off before you're able to do that, just email me. And I'll make sure y'all get credit. But otherwise, please show up next week if you can. We're going to talk about things we can do and say as a result of the NAR settlement. It's time to play offense on this deal and just kind of think worst case scenario so that we're prepared. I don't think it's going to be that bad, but I want to make sure that we address it.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad, as always.
Thanks, guys. Y'all take care.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Bye.